I began the last episode with Caligula's massive luxury cruise liners, these 70-meter long floating palaces on ships. But how did these forgotten wonders of the ancient world end up on the bottom of Lake Nemi in Italy? They were sunk on purpose. When Caligula was killed by his own guards, all vestiges of his hated regime were blotted out from the historical record, including those amazing ships. Archaeologists still occasionally find inscriptions or coins or other artifacts of Caligula's reign which show the emperor's name scratched or blotted out. The Pax Romana under Augustus had begun with such high hopes, and with Caligula, the Pax Romana degenerated into farce. And now that Caligula was dead, did the Senate really wish to keep it going? Or was it time to end the Principate and to go back to the Republic? Well, the choice would be made for them by the Praetorian Guard, and it was a bit of a shocker. Find out what they did on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 13, Empire for Sale. The conspiracy to assassinate Caligula was a smashing success. The hated emperor was dead, but the senators who were involved in the conspiracy quickly realized that they had a unique opportunity to actually end the regime itself, to end the Principate, not just murder an emperor, but abolish the whole thing, maybe even restore the Roman Republic, or at least something like it. The death of Caligula brought a moment of chaos when something radical like that could happen. There were soldiers moving through the city on the hunt for surviving members of Caligula's family, as well as any nobles who had given the now dead emperor their support. Blood was running through the streets of Rome. Eventually, soldiers found Caligula's wife and his young daughter, and they murdered them in cold blood. And as the rampage carried on, soldiers swept through the imperial palace, and a group of them found, hiding behind a curtain, the last surviving male member of the imperial family, Caligula's uncle, Claudius. Now at this point, Claudius was in his early 50s. He was the grandson of Mark Antony and Augustus's sister Octavia, and the brother of Caligula's late father, the wildly popular general Germanicus, who died an untimely death under Tiberius by what seems to have been poisoning. I recount this family history to show you that Claudius was not a nobody. He was not somebody that was completely forgotten. He had a very impressive pedigree. He was also a good-looking man. This is what Suetonius says, quote, "He possessed majesty and dignity of appearance, but only when he was standing still or sitting. He was tall, but not slender, with an attractive face, becoming white hair, and a full neck." That's Suetonius' biography of Claudius. So here was a man that looked the part. He looked like a leader. He looked maybe even like an emperor. But Suetonius does not end his description there. And by reading what he says next, we learn a little bit more about Claudius and why it was that he had not been considered for the position of emperor before. We also learn a little bit about what the Romans think about people with disabilities. Quote, "But when Claudius walked, his weak knees gave way under him, and he had many disagreeable traits. He had an unseemly cackle. His anger was even more disgusting, and he would foam at the mouth and trickle snot at the nose. He stuttered and stammered and shook his head at almost all times, but especially when he became impassioned." That's again Suetonius' biography of Claudius. The description is interesting. We don't know exactly what medical condition or conditions ailed Claudius. Cerebral palsy is one possibility. Tourette syndrome might be another. But it's clear that Claudius had an impressive mind. But in Roman culture, physical disability was often conflated with mental disorders and even low intelligence. So Claudius stuttered, His speech was broken, he cackled, his body seems to have been weak. So despite his impressive pedigree and his classic good looks, these ailments justified, at least within the bounds of Roman culture, that he would be ignored and even mocked. It was not only strangers and not behind his back that this happened, but even his own family members, his own mother and grandmother, sister, were all especially cruel to him. Suetonius tells us more. Quote, his mother often called him a monster of a man, not finished, but merely begun by Mother Nature. And if his mother accused anyone of stupidity, she used to say that he was a bigger fool than her son Claudius. His grandmother, Livia, always treated him with the utmost contempt, very rarely speaking to him, and when she admonished him, she did so in short, harsh letters or through messengers. And when his sister heard that he might one day become emperor, she openly and loudly prayed that the Roman people might be spared so cruel and undeserved a fortune. That's again Suetonius' biography of Claudius. So that's the man that was hiding behind the curtain, the last remaining member of an illustrious family. And again, this is history. This really happened. There was a decision to be made after Caligula's assassination. What was Claudius's fate going to be? Well, as I said, Claudius was in fact not stupid. He was very, very smart. And in some ways, he was smarter than his nephew Caligula, because Caligula ignored the power of the Praetorian Guard and got himself killed because of it. But Claudius recognized that the Praetorians were perhaps the most important power broker in this new form of autocratic government. So while the Praetorian soldiers found Claudius hiding behind the curtain, he apparently offered them a deal. His quick thinking not only saved his life, but made this somewhat unlikely man into Rome's fourth emperor. But winning the initial support of the Praetorian Guard didn't immediately restore stability in Rome. Violence had broken out. The city was not under control. Even the imperial palace was not safe. We have to remember that there were probably members of the Senate at this time still looking to assassinate everybody. All of Caligula's family needed to die if, for example, the Republic was going to be restored. So somebody might use the lawlessness of the moment as an opportunity to kill Claudius, despite his deal with the Praetorians. So the Praetorian soldiers carried Claudius back into their camp, which was built along the northeastern corner of the walls at the edge of Rome, arguably one of the most fortified spots in the entire city. Now, was it there that Claudius and the Praetorians negotiated the final amount? For it was money that Claudius offered the Praetorians in order to spare his life. And we actually know from documents what the final sum was: 15,000 sesterces per Praetorian guardsman. That means if the Praetorians numbered about 5,000 men, Claudius bought the entire Roman Empire for something close to 75 million sesterces. To give you some perspective, that would be the collective wealth of about 50, maybe 60 Roman senators. But what's even more fascinating about the fact that the empire was bought was that it was bought completely in the open. Claudius's payment to the Praetorian Guards, and indeed the whole episode, was essentially public news. In fact, even the coins that were minted in the first year of Claudius's reign tell the story of what happened in two iconic images. The first coin shows an image of the Praetorians' camp, guarded by a single loyal Praetorian after the assassination of Caligula. And below that image on the coin, there's an inscription that says, quote, "The emperor is received." And then there's a second coin and a second image. It's twin. This shows a Praetorian soldier standing next to Claudius as he wears his imperial toga. The new emperor is reaching out and shaking hands with the Praetorian. And below this image is a similar inscription that basically is the mirror image of the message on the first coin. Quote, "The Praetorians are received." The coins are almost like one of those heart necklaces that you get in middle school that say friends forever or true love or something like that. And then you break the heart into two pieces. Then one person wears one piece and one wears the other, and you could join it together. The two coins basically do that. They record two sides of the story of how Claudius became emperor. First, the Praetorians received Claudius into their camp and made him emperor. And then Claudius received the Praetorians and gave them a cash reward for doing that. It really is amazing if you think about it. Remember Augustus? The true nature of the government that he created, this military autocracy. Augustus covered that up with a thick layer of Republican wallpaper. He didn't want it overtly declared that this was something completely different. He tried to give the impression at every turn that the Republic had been restored. But Claudius had taken over now less than 30 years after Augustus's death, and he's got Roman coins openly proclaiming that one man was given control of the entire empire by paying off the Praetorian Guard of the previous emperor. So it was now obvious that the emperor's power was not based on titles or powers granted to him by the Senate, that whole illusion that Augustus tried to portray, but rather to rule over the Roman Empire, one needed to secure the loyalty of the Praetorians, and that loyalty in turn could be bought. The Praetorians were perfectly happy for this new arrangement to be very well known, because if they were the emperor makers, then maybe more people would bid for power in the future, and they could expect higher and higher salaries. This was a very good deal for them. But the Senate, of course, was not happy with this arrangement, and they weren't totally impotent either. And we see this at the very beginning of Claudius's reign as well. Why did he have to go into the Praetorian camp? Claudius had the Praetorian guards behind him. That does mean something. But he actually stayed in the camp for a full month under guard. Why did he do this? Another ancient source, the Roman senator Cassius Dio, tells us that Claudius was concerned about his security. Quote, after seeing how Caligula had perished and learning that senators had proposed others for the throne that they thought better than Claudius, the new emperor was terrified. And so he became exceedingly careful, requiring anybody who came near him, both men and women, to be searched, fearing that they might have a dagger. And at banquets, he would always have soldiers present. That's Cassius Dio in his Roman history. So Claudius had hardly been a unanimous choice in the Senate for emperor. And some senators seemed to want none of the above. They didn't want any emperor after Caligula's horror show. Claudius was right, really, to be concerned for his safety. And even though he would end up restoring stability in the office of emperor with a reign of more than a decade, the way that he became emperor, as well as the Senate's initial lack of unified backing, would come to define the years of Claudius as an era of mistrust and hostility between princeps and Senate. And we'll see this in the next few episodes. Claudius would have very little use for the Senate during his reign. Instead, he would choose to run the Roman Empire largely through members of his inner circle, and that included some unexpected people. Former slaves, for example, even women. The most influential of these women, and we'll talk about her in a few episodes, this woman was Caligula's sister, a woman who would eventually become mother to one of the most infamous emperors in history, Nero. So for now, it's just important that you know that Claudius was in charge, and the Senate really did not have much choice in the end but to yield to the man that the Praetorians chose as emperor. But as we'll see in the next episode, the Pax Romana did quite well under Claudius. The sources portray him as a bumbling fool, but Claudius cobbled together a base of power that included soldiers, confidants, and also the mob. Because Claudius, despite never gaining the Senate's trust, was actually beloved by the Roman people. And that brings up a question. What made this man, who even his own family had rejected, a man who Roman culture said was unfit to rule, What gave Claudius his cachet with the Roman people? We'll find out in the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Dr. Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.